The oppressive silence of Aurelia, Chicago's most coveted reservation, was a language Leo Vance understood perfectly. It was the sound of money, of power so absolute it no longer needed to shout. Here, conversations were murmurs. The clinking of Christoffel silverware against Bernardeau porcelain was a delicate symphony, and the city's skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a galaxy he had personally purchased. At 34, Leo had purchased most things he'd ever wanted. His data analytics firm, Vantage Point, had revolutionized predictive market behavior, making him a billionaire before he'd seen his first grey hair. Yet, as he swirled $100 glass of Pinot Noir, the familiar, gnawing emptiness settled in his gut. It was the curse of the summit. There was nowhere left to climb, only the long, lonely view down. His dinner companion, a venture capitalist named Sterling, was droning on about server scalability. Leo nodded at the appropriate intervals, his mind processing the words as pure data streams, devoid of human interest. He was about to feign a headache when a movement across the room snagged his attention, a flicker of familiarity in the choreographed dance of the waitstaff. A woman with hair the color of autumn wheat, pulled back in a simple, severe bun, was clearing a nearby table. Her movements were efficient, economical, born of fatigue and repetition. But it was the way she held her head, a slight, defiant tilt he'd known his entire life, that made the air freeze in his lungs. The wine glass paused halfway to his lips. The sounds of the restaurant, Sterling's voice, the distant piano, the soft scrape of a chair, receded into a dull hum. It couldn't be. Not here. Not like this. He watched her stack the plates, her brow furrowed in concentration. The crisp black uniform couldn't conceal the faint lines of worry etched around her eyes, or the weary slump of her shoulders that hadn't been there when they were 17 and believed the world was a map of infinite possibilities. Clara Hayes. The name echoed in the silent chambers of his memory, a ghost from a life he had surgically excised. Clara, who had taught him how to skip stones across Miller's Pond in their dusty Iowa hometown. Clara, whose quiet belief in him had been the only currency he'd possessed when he'd left Havenwood, with nothing but a scholarship and a ferocious, desperate hunger. And now she was here, in his world, but not of his world, clearing away the remnants of a feast she could never afford. In that instant, the carefully constructed edifice of Leo Vance, the tech titan, the self-made man, fractured. A raw, forgotten current of guilt, shock, and an emotion he couldn't name surged through him, so potent it felt like a physical blow. Their eyes met across the expanse of linen and crystal. For a heartbeat, her professional mask remained intact. Then, a flicker of disbelief, a widening of her deep blue eyes, and her world, just like his, came to a dead, silent stop. The chain of events that would unravel both their lives had just been forged. Leo had built his empire on the principle of emotional detachment. Data was pure. Data was honest. People, he'd learned, were messy variables. His childhood in Havenwood had been a case study in messy. His father, a good man with bad luck, had lost the family farm to a bank that saw them only as a negative entry on a ledger. That humiliation had planted a seed of cold fury in young Leo. He'd vowed to become the one who owned the ledgers, the one who could never be erased. Clara had been his anchor in that storm. While he was consumed with escaping their small town, she was absorbed in preserving it. She loved the town's history, spending hours in the dusty local library, carefully handling brittle, yellowed documents, fascinated by the stories of the people who had come before. Her dream was to be an archivist, a keeper of memories. Every piece of paper, Every photograph is a life, she'd told him once, her eyes shining with a passion he both admired and failed to comprehend. He was focused on the future. She was devoted to the past. They were an unlikely pair, the boy racing toward the horizon and the girl tending the roots. She was the only one who saw the fear beneath his ambition. He was the only one who understood that her quiet nature concealed a formidable intellect and an unyielding sense of integrity. They'd made a pact under the sprawling branches of the town's oldest oak tree. He would go out and conquer the world, and she would always be his touchstone, the one person who remembered who he was before the conquest. He had broken that pact. College became a blur of coding and competitions. His first startup demanded 100-hour weeks. The calls to Clara grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. He told himself it was necessary. To build the walls high enough to keep failure out, you couldn't afford windows that looked back. Success came, torrential and overwhelming. He moved to Chicago, bought a penthouse overlooking the lake, and surrounded himself with people who spoke his language: IPOs, acquisitions, and exit strategies. He hadn't thought about Havenwood or Clara in years, or so he had convinced himself. Now, seeing her here, the carefully constructed dam of his memory burst. He remembered the smell of the old library, the sound of her laughter, the steadfast look in her eyes as she'd waved goodbye, a promise of return hanging unspoken in the air between them, a promise he had never kept. Sterling had finally stopped talking, noticing Leo's fixed gaze. "Everything all right, Vance?" Leo ignored him. He watched as Clara's manager, a severe-looking man with a pinched face, approached her and spoke in a low, sharp tone. Clara nodded, her expression shuttering back into one of professional deference. She picked up her tray and turned, deliberately avoiding Leo's table. The dismissal was a physical sting. He had become just another customer, another mess for her to clean up. He stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped against the polished floor, drawing a few annoyed glances. "Excuse me," he said to Sterling, his voice tight. He walked toward the service station where Clara was loading plates into a dumbwaiter. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. She didn't turn around immediately. He could see the tension in her shoulders. When she finally faced him, her face was a careful, blank slate. "Sir, is there a problem with your service?" The word "sir" was a wall between them, 1,000 miles high. "Don't do that," he said, his voice low. "Don't pretend you don't know me." Her composure cracked, just for a second. A flash of old hurt crossed her features. "I'm working, Leo. This isn't the time or the place." "When is the time?" "After your shift? I'll wait." She looked over his shoulder, at the opulent room, at the man he was dining with, at the life that was so clearly his. A bitter, weary smile touched her lips. "My shift ends at 1. You won't wait." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a summary of the last 15 years. "I will," he said, the words a vow. "I'll be right here." He returned to his table, the taste of expensive wine now like ash in his mouth. He ended the dinner with Sterling, citing a sudden migraine. Then he moved to the bar, ordered a club soda, and waited. For 3.5 hours he sat there, a statue in a bespoke suit, ignoring the curious stares of the staff and the late-night patrons. He watched Clara move through the room, a phantom from his past. He saw the subtle wince when a customer was rude, the forced smile when her manager reprimanded her for a minor infraction, the deep, bone weariness that settled over her as the restaurant slowly emptied. Each observation was a fresh twist of the knife of his own guilt. He had conquered the world, but he had abandoned its one true inhabitant. By the time she emerged from the staff entrance at 1:15 a.m., dressed in worn jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, the weight of his broken promise felt heavier than his entire net worth. The Chicago air was cool and damp as they stood on the sidewalk, the city's roar muted to a late-night hum. The awkward silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken years. Clara hugged her thin jacket closer, not looking at him. "You waited," she finally said, her voice flat, as if acknowledging a surprising data point. "I told you I would." He gestured to a 24-hour diner across the street, its neon sign a beacon of greasy, unpretentious light in the chic neighborhood. "Can we talk, please? I'll buy you a coffee. Or I guess I'll buy you the whole diner if you want." The attempt at humor fell flat, sounding as hollow and arrogant as he felt. She gave him a sharp look. "I don't want you to buy me anything, Leo. I just want to know why you're here." "I saw you. I was shocked. I'm a waitress. People see me all night. It's the job." They crossed the street and slid into a cracked vinyl booth. The diner smelled of stale coffee and fried onions, a world away from Aurelia's curated atmosphere of truffle oil and ambition. A waitress with tired eyes took their order. 2 black coffees. When they were alone again, Leo leaned forward. "What happened, Clara? The last I heard, you were finishing your master's in library science. You were going to curate the Historical Society back home." A shadow passed over her face. She stirred her coffee, though it needed no stirring. "Life happened," she said evasively. "My mom got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that insurance doesn't like to cover." He remembered her mother, a kind, gentle woman who always had cookies waiting for him after school. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "How could you?" she replied, without malice, just stating a fact. "The treatments went on for years. I dropped out of my program to take care of her. We used up her savings, then mine. We sold the house. When she passed away 2 years ago, there was nothing left but debt, a mountain of it." She took a sip of coffee, her gaze fixed on the dark liquid. "I came to Chicago to start over. I thought with my experience, I could get a job in a museum, a university library, anywhere. But the field is competitive, and without the finished degree, I was just another applicant. The waitressing job was supposed to be temporary, a way to pay the bills while I figured things out. That was a 1.5 years ago. Her story was delivered in a clipped, factual tone, as if she were cataloguing someone else's misfortunes. Leo felt a cold dread seep into him. While he had been celebrating 9-figure valuations, she had been watching her mother fade away, her own dreams turning to dust. "Why didn't you call me?" The question was out before he could stop it. She finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the full depth of her exhaustion and her pride. "Call you? The tech prodigy on the cover of Forbes? What would I have said? 'Hey, Leo, remember me? The girl from your past. My life is a complete disaster, and I need you to swoop in and save me with your billions.'" Her voice was laced with a bitter irony. "I have my pride, Leo. It's about the only thing I have left." He recoiled as if slapped. "It wouldn't have been like that." "Wouldn't it?" she challenged, her blue eyes pinning him. "You live in a different universe now. We don't even speak the same language anymore." He fell silent because she was right. His world was one of leverage and assets. Hers was one of survival. He wanted, desperately, to fix it. To write a check, make a call, erase her problems with the casual ease his wealth afforded him. But he saw the fierce, unyielding dignity in her eyes, and knew that such a gesture would be another form of abandonment, a dismissal of her struggle, an insult to her resilience. He noticed then, for the first time, the way she was observing the diner around them. Her gaze wasn't vacant, it was active. She clocked the cook rubbing his tired eyes, the young couple in the corner booth having a hushed argument, the way the night manager discreetly pocketed a 20 from the register. She was reading the room, gathering data just as he did in a boardroom. But her data points were human. It was a skill she'd always had, that quiet, intense observation. She saw the stories people tried to hide. "You're still doing it," he said softly. "Doing what?" "Seeing everything. You used to do that in the library. You'd know who had checked out which book just by the look on their face when they walked in." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he'd seen all night. "It's a habit. You learn a lot about people by watching them when they think no one is looking." He saw an opening, a way to connect on terms that weren't about money. "Let me help," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Not as a handout, as an investment. You're the smartest person I ever knew, Clara. It's a crime that you're not using that brain. Let me cover your expenses so you can finish your degree. Call it a loan. Set whatever terms you want. But don't let this city grind you down to nothing." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. He could see the internal conflict, the war between her desperate need and her stubborn pride. He was a complication she didn't want, a reminder of a past she had tried to bury. He also represented the only tangible escape route she'd seen in years. "I need to think about it," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. She stood up, placing a few crumpled dollars on the table for her coffee. "I have to go. I have an early start." He didn't try to stop her. He just watched her walk out of the diner and disappear into the pre-dawn gloom of the city. As he sat alone in the booth, the smell of burnt coffee filling his senses, Leo Vance, the man who could predict the future of the global economy, had no idea what to do next. He had reconnected with his past, only to find it was more broken than he could ever have imagined. And he was beginning to suspect that fixing it would cost him more than just money. It might cost him the person he had become. The days that followed were a tightrope walk over a chasm of awkwardness and history. Leo, accustomed to decisive action, found himself paralyzed by uncertainty. He got Clara's number from the restaurant manager under the guise of complimenting her service, a move that felt both clever and deeply sleazy. He texted her, a simple, "Thinking of you. The offer stands." Her reply came hours later. "I'm still thinking." He threw himself into his work, trying to drown out the disquieting new voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his conscience. He was in the final stages of a hostile takeover of a rival data firm, a ruthless, high-stakes battle against an equally formidable predator named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was everything Leo purported to despise, but secretly recognized in himself: cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of sentiment. The deal was consuming, a complex game of corporate chess that usually thrilled him. Now it felt like moving pieces on a meaningless board. He kept picturing Clara's face, the exhaustion in her eyes. He had his assistant do a discreet background check, another violation that made him feel small, and the report confirmed her story, adding a grim new layer. The debt from her mother's illness was staggering, a figure that would take a lifetime of waitressing to pay off. She was living in a tiny, run-down apartment in a neighborhood on the verge of being unsafe. He decided to change tactics. Instead of offering solutions, he offered something simpler: friendship. He texted again. "Forget the loan. How about dinner? Some place with no tablecloths. My treat." To his surprise, she agreed. They met at a small, family-run Italian place in her neighborhood. The air was thick with the smell of garlic and oregano. Clara seemed more relaxed here, on her own turf. She wore the same faded sweatshirt, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the girl he used to know. They talked for hours, carefully navigating the minefield of the intervening years. She spoke of her mother's courage, the small joys they found, even in the darkest days. He found himself opening up in a way he hadn't with anyone in over a decade, confessing the profound isolation of his success, the transactional nature of his relationships, the feeling that he was living inside a gilded cage. "You know," she said, a wry smile on her face as she pushed a meatball around her plate. "I used to track your career. I'd see you in magazines. I was proud of you. But I always wondered if the boy who was terrified of ending up like his father was still in there somewhere." "He is," Leo admitted, his voice rough. "He's just been buried under a lot of stock options." During their dinner, he saw her observational skills in action again. She correctly deduced from the owner's anxious hovering and the half-empty dining room that the restaurant was struggling. She noticed a loose thread on Leo's cuff that his own assistant had missed. It was a quiet superpower, this ability to see the details that formed the bigger picture. He realized with a jolt that this was the very essence of what his company did with data, only she did it with the human heart. He brought up the loan again, gently this time. "Think of it as a strategic partnership, Clara. I'm investing in talent. It's what I do. You have a rare talent that's being wasted. Let me provide the capital. You provide the genius. We both win." She looked at him, her gaze searching. "What's your angle, Leo?" "Nobody does anything for nothing. Not in your world." His initial motive had been guilt, a desire to assuage his own conscience. But it was becoming something more. Being with her was like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a sterile lab. She reminded him of a part of himself he thought was long dead. "My angle," he said slowly, "is that I miss my friend. And I hate seeing her life dictated by a pile of medical bills. I hate that the world is this unfair. I can't fix the whole world, but I can fix this part of it." This time she didn't refuse outright. "Let me see the terms," she said, the archivist in her demanding documentation. "I'll want a formal contract, a repayment schedule, with interest." He almost laughed with relief. "Whatever you want. My lawyers will draft something that would stand up in the Supreme Court." The agreement was drawn up. It was a formal, binding loan document, just as she'd requested. The repayment terms were generous, deferred until 2 years after she completed her doctorate, at a minimal interest rate. Signing it was one of the most terrifying things she had ever done. It meant accepting help. It meant letting him in. Clara quit her job at Aurelia. The relief was so profound, it made her dizzy. She spent the next few weeks buried in applications, re-enrolling in the University of Chicago's prestigious library and information science program. The fire he had seen in her as a girl was rekindled, and with it, a light returned to her eyes. Leo found himself rearranging his schedule to spend time with her. They explored the city's hidden corners, old bookstores, forgotten historical markers, small museums. She showed him a Chicago he never knew existed, a city of stories and ghosts, far from the gleaming towers of finance. Through her eyes, the world began to regain its color and texture. But his own world continued to spin. The battle with Marcus Thorne for control of the rival firm, Data Corp, was reaching its endgame. Thorne was fighting dirty, planting negative stories in the press, trying to poach Leo's key engineers. It was a war of attrition, and Marcus was a master of psychological warfare. One evening, Leo was at his penthouse on a tense conference call regarding the deal, when Clara came over. She had brought a box of old photographs she'd salvaged from her mother's things, thinking he might like to see them. As he barked orders into his headset, she quietly sat on the floor, spreading the faded pictures across the expensive rug. He finished his call, feeling drained and agitated. He saw her there, surrounded by images of their shared childhood. A grainy photo of them at a county fair, another of them on a rickety tree swing. She was looking at a picture of him, aged 10, holding a prize-winning pumpkin, a gap-toothed, triumphant grin on his face. "I remember that day," she said softly. "You were so proud of that pumpkin. You spent the whole summer tending to it." He looked at the boy in the photo, a boy filled with simple joy, and felt a universe of distance. The man he was now wouldn't know how to grow a pumpkin. He only knew how to acquire the companies that sold the seeds. "I have a meeting," he said abruptly, his tone harsher than he intended. "With the DataCorp board. It's critical." Clara looked up, her expression clouded with hurt. "Okay, Leo." She began to gather the photos, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It's just this deal. Thorn is playing for keeps." "I know," she said, her voice quiet. She held up a photo of the two of them, aged 17, standing by the old oak tree. "Just don't lose the things that can't be bought back." Her words hung in the air long after she left. He was winning his war with Marcus Thorn, but her quiet warning made him wonder if he was losing a much more important battle with himself. The final showdown was set to take place, not in a boardroom, but over a meticulously planned dinner at Aurelia. Leo had managed to secure a private meeting with two key DataCorp board members, a pair of wavering old money siblings who held the deciding votes. His goal was to win them over with his vision, his stability, and his undeniable track record. He knew Marcus Thorn would try to interfere. He just didn't know how. The day of the dinner, Clara called him. "I got a call from Aurelia," she said, an odd note in her voice. "They're short-staffed tonight because of the flu. My old manager asked if I could cover a shift in one of the private dining rooms. He's desperate. He even offered double pay." A cold premonition slid down Leo's spine. "Which dining room?" "The Vanguard room," she said. His blood ran cold. It was the room he had booked for his meeting. "Clara, no! You can't! That's my meeting!" "I know," she said, and now he could hear the resolve in her voice. "That's why I said yes. You told me Thorn plays dirty. You're a brilliant strategist, Leo, but you see systems, not people. I see people. Let me be your eyes and ears in that room. I know the staff, the layout, every blind spot. If Thorn tries anything, I'll see it coming." "Absolutely not," he shot back, his protective instincts roaring to life. "It's too dangerous. I don't want you anywhere near him." "And I don't want to see him destroy you," she countered, her voice firm. "You gave me a chance to get my life back, Leo. Let me help you protect yours. I won't be a damsel in distress waiting for you to rescue me. We're partners, remember? This is my part." He argued, he pleaded, but she was immovable. Her quiet strength was a force of nature he was only just beginning to appreciate. He finally relented, his gut twisting with a fear that had nothing to do with business. The most important deal of his life was about to go down, and his greatest asset wasn't his fortune or his intellect. It was the woman he had once left behind, now willingly walking back into the line of fire for him. The Vanguard room at Aurelia was an island of hushed tension. Leo sat across from Arthur and Beatrice Hemlock, the silver-haired siblings whose family had founded DataCorp 3 generations ago. They were polite, reserved, and their faces betrayed nothing. Leo was making his pitch, laying out a future of innovation and growth, when the door opened. Marcus Thorn entered, a predatory smile gracing his lips. "Arthur, "Beatrice," he purred, gliding to the table as if he'd been invited. "I do apologize for the intrusion. I just heard you were meeting with my competitor, and I couldn't resist stopping by to ensure he was giving you the full picture." Leo's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Thorne, I wasn't aware this was a party." "Oh, it's always a party when the future of an empire is at stake," Marcus replied, his eyes glittering. It was then that Clara entered, dressed in her crisp black uniform, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She moved to the table with a water pitcher, her presence so seamless that the Hemlocks barely registered her. But Leo saw the minute tensing of her shoulders. Marcus gave her a dismissive, fleeting glance, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture, and then ignored her completely. The dinner became a verbal sparring match. Marcus, with surgical precision, began to undermine Leo's proposal, raising doubts about his management style, hinting at undisclosed liabilities. He was charming, persuasive, and utterly venomous. Leo countered every point, but he could feel the Hemlock's confidence wavering. Clara moved in and out of the room, clearing plates, refilling glasses. Her movements were silent, invisible. But Leo knew she was watching, listening. Her mind, trained to catalogue and connect disparate pieces of information, was working. He saw her notice the way Marcus's associate, a man waiting discreetly by the door, kept tapping his briefcase. He saw her clock the subtle, almost imperceptible nod Marcus gave the man as the main course was being served. The turning point came with the dessert course. Leo had prepared a final presentation, a set of sleek, leather-bound portfolios containing the definitive financial projections and a detailed transition plan. He placed them in front of Arthur and Beatrice. "This is my final offer," Leo said, his voice steady. "It's all there. Transparent. Honest." As he spoke, Marcus launched into a final, eloquent appeal, a masterful performance of feigned concern for the Hemlock family legacy. While all eyes were on Marcus, his associate approached the table, ostensibly to hand Marcus his coat. In a movement so swift it was almost invisible, the associate switched the portfolio in front of Arthur Hemlock with an identical one from his briefcase. No one saw it. Not Leo, not the Hemlocks, but Clara. The silence that descended upon the Vanguard room was a different kind of quiet from the one Leo Vance had cultivated his entire life. It was not the polished, expensive silence of power, but the raw, breathless vacuum left in the wake of a detonated truth. The acrid scent of spilled coffee, a scent of cheap diners and early mornings, hung in the air, a vulgar intruder in this temple of haute cuisine. It smelled, Leo thought with a dizzying sense of clarity, like reality. He watched Marcus Thorne's face, a mask of aristocratic composure cracking to reveal the raw, ugly fury beneath. He saw the Hemlocks, Arthur and Beatrice, their shrewd, old-money eyes flickering from the sodden, ruined portfolio to Thorne's incandescent rage, and then to the waitress. The waitress, Clara. She stood there, a perfect tableau of mortified apology, her hand pressed to her chest, her breathing shallow. But Leo saw beyond the performance. He saw the bedrock of resolve in her stance, the unyielding strength in the set of her jaw. In that moment, she was not a clumsy server. She was a queen who had just checkmated a king, using nothing but a coffee pot as her rook. "You incompetent fool!" The words ripped from Thorne's throat, a venomous tear in the room's fragile fabric. Leo moved then, his body acting before his mind had fully processed the sheer, audacious genius of her gambit. He stepped between them, a physical shield, placing a hand on Clara's arm. The contact was electric, a grounding wire in the storm. Her muscles were tense, vibrating with adrenaline. Now, Marcus." Leo's voice was unnervingly calm, a layer of ice over the churning sea of his emotions. It was an accident. These things happen. He turned his gaze to Clara, and in that brief, private look, he tried to pour a novel's worth of gratitude, of awe, of something terrifyingly close to love. "Are you all right?" She gave a small, trembling nod, her eyes wide, never breaking character. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll be fired for this." "Nonsense," Leo said, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. He looked back at the Hemlocks, who were watching this drama with the keen interest of seasoned theatre critics. "Arthur, Beatrice, my sincerest apologies for this disruption." He allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Fortunately, I believe in redundancy planning." He retrieved his own briefcase, the click of its latches echoing like gunshots in the silence. He withdrew 2 pristine portfolios, identical to the others, and placed them on the table. The real, untampered with numbers. The word untampered did its work. It hung in the air, shimmering and sharp. Arthur Hemlock's gaze sharpened. He was a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of corporate succession and boardroom betrayals for 50 years. He understood sabotage not as a theoretical concept, but as a practical tool of the trade. He looked at the ruined portfolio, a pulpy mess of lies. He looked at Thorne's face, contorted with a fury that was entirely out of proportion to a simple spill. He looked at Thorne's associate, who seemed to be trying to merge with the wallpaper. Finally, his gaze rested on Clara, the humble catalyst, and a slow, deep understanding dawned in his pale blue eyes. Beatrice Hemlock broke the spell. A dry, sharp laugh escaped her lips. "Well," she declared, her voice crisp as autumn leaves as she opened the new portfolio, "I do appreciate a man who comes prepared for spills." It was over. The air shifted, the tension dissipating like smoke. Marcus Thorne stood defeated, not by a superior financial model or a more ruthless strategy, but by a ghost from his opponent's past and a cup of cheap coffee. He was an emperor undone by a fly. He cast one final look at Leo, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, and then his eyes shifted to Clara. The contempt in that gaze was a physical thing, a poison dart. Then he turned and swept from the room, a diminished king abandoning his lost battlefield, his pale associate trailing in his wake like a chastened ghost. The deal was concluded in a haze of civility. The Hemlocks, now firmly in his camp, were gracious, impressed by a victory that was as much about character as it was about capital. When they had finally departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive perfume and quiet satisfaction, Leo and Clara were left alone in the wreckage of their triumph. The room felt cavernous, the table a landscape of discarded linen and crystal. He turned to her, the adrenaline finally giving way to a profound, bone-deep tremor. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara's carefully constructed mask of the flustered waitress dissolved. Her shoulders slumped with the release of a tension she must have held for hours. A shaky, utterly exhausted smile touched her lips. "I saw the switch," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I was watching his associate's hands all night. He was nervous, sweating. His briefcase was his tell. It was always within reach, angled toward the table." She gestured to the soggy portfolio. "I couldn't prove it, my word against his. So I created a preservation issue. Archivists are trained to deal with water damage." He closed the 2 steps between them, his movements slow, as if approaching a rare and magnificent creature he was afraid of startling. He reached up, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. Her skin was cool. He could feel the faint, rapid pulse in her temple. That was the bravest, most brilliant, most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. I told you, she whispered, her body finally allowing itself to tremble, her deep blue eyes locking with his. Partners. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of conquest or sudden passion. It was a kiss of recognition, of homecoming. It was slow and deep and desperate, a drowning man's first breath of air. It tasted of relief and coffee and the startling, unfamiliar flavor of hope. In the opulent silence of the vanguard room, surrounded by the detritus of a corporate war, Leo Vance finally understood the true meaning of value. He hadn't just acquired a company. He had been given a chance to reclaim his own humanity. The drive back to his penthouse was a study in shared silence. The city lights smeared across the windows of the Maybach, a river of fractured diamonds. Clara sat beside him, not touching, looking out at the Chicago she knew from bus stops and late-night walks, now viewed from behind the tinted glass of his gilded world. The chasm between their lives had never felt wider or more irrelevant. Inside his apartment, the silence was different. It was sterile, amplified by the sheer scale of the space, art that cost more than a house hung on the walls, and the view of Lake Michigan was a vast, indifferent darkness. Clara walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, a small, solitary figure against the infinite skyline. "They fired me, you know," she said, her voice soft, her reflection a pale ghost on the glass. "My manager called while you were signing the final papers with the Hemlocks. He was apologetic. 'A liability,' he said. 'Unfortunate, but necessary.'" The old Leo, the titan of industry, surged forward. A primal, protective anger flared in his chest. "I'll handle it. I'll buy the restaurant and fire him. I'll have my lawyers draft a lawsuit for wrongful termination. That will—" No. The word was quiet, but it stopped him cold. She turned from the window to face him, her expression serious, her exhaustion replaced by a familiar, formidable resolve. "Don't you see, Leo? That's the problem. That's your answer to everything. Deploy the money, unleash the lawyers, reshape the world to your will." She took a step toward him. "I didn't do what I did tonight so you could rescue me. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because my partner was in trouble. If our partnership is going to mean anything, you have to stop trying to fix my life and start letting me live it. With you." He felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. His instinct was to pave over her problems with his wealth, to make her life as smooth and frictionless as his own. But that wasn't partnership. It was ownership. It was turning her into another one of his beautiful, expensive acquisitions. "You're right," he said, the admission costing him a piece of his old, arrogant self. "I'm sorry. My instincts are wired wrong." "Then we rewire them," she said simply. Together. The next morning, he found her in his home office, sitting before his bank of monitors that displayed a constant, flowing river of global market data. She was looking at the streams of numbers, the endless green and red ticks that dictated the fortunes of millions. "This is how you see the world," she said, not looking at him. "As patterns, probabilities, assets, and liabilities." "It's what I'm good at," he admitted, standing behind her. "You are," she agreed, "but you're missing the stories." She pointed to a ticker for a struggling agricultural conglomerate. "That's not just a stock price. That's a town in Iowa, where the plant is the only employer. That's a third-generation farmer wondering if he'll lose his land, just like your father did. Every single data point is a life, Leo, a hope, a fear. You taught yourself to forget that." He looked at the screen, and for the first time, he tried to see what she saw. He tried to see the people behind the percentages, the families behind the quarterly reports. It was like learning a new language, a language his heart knew, but his mind had long since suppressed. Later that day, they sat at his massive granite kitchen island. He had the loan document his lawyers had drafted for her, the one that had felt so generous, so magnanimous at the time. Now it looked like what it was, a chain, however gilded. "I have a new contract for you to sign," he said, pushing a single sheet of paper across the island. She looked at him, wary. On the paper was a single sentence, handwritten in his sharp, decisive script. "This partnership is founded on mutual trust and respect, with all debts, past and present, considered paid in full." Below the line, he had already signed his name. Tears welled in her eyes. She picked up the pen and, with a hand that was perfectly steady, signed her name beside his. Then, together, they took the old, formal loan agreement, tore it into small pieces, and let the fragments fall into the wastebasket, a quiet, ceremonial destruction of the power imbalance between them. Clara re-enrolled at the university, not with the frantic desperation of a woman running from debt, but with the focused passion of a scholar reclaiming her destiny. She moved out of his penthouse and into a modest apartment near campus, a space that was entirely her own. It was a crucial boundary, a statement that she was building her own life alongside his, not within it. Leo, to his own surprise, understood and respected it. He learned to court her, to visit her in her world of dusty bookshelves and academic debates. He brought her coffee during late-night study sessions and listened, truly listened, as she explained the intricacies of 19th-century manuscript preservation. His own world began its seismic shift. The acquisition of DataCorp was finalized, making him one of the most powerful figures in the tech industry. But the victory felt different. He saw the fear in the eyes of the DataCorp employees, people who viewed him as the conquering barbarian at the gates. Remembering Clara's words, he saw their stories. Instead of the ruthless purge his board expected, he initiated a series of town halls. He walked the floors, he talked to engineers and administrative assistants, and he promoted from within, choosing a brilliant, empathetic woman who had been with DataCorp for a decade to lead the integration. It was an unprecedented move, one that baffled his investors and infuriated his more predatory board members. "You're going soft, Vance," one of them, a grizzled private equity titan, told him over lunch. "This foundation nonsense, this new management style, people are saying you've lost your edge." "Maybe," Leo replied, swirling the water in his glass. "Or maybe I've just realized the edge is a very lonely place to live." He poured his energy and resources into the Havenwood project. It became his obsession, a penance, and a passion. He flew his best engineers to the small Iowa town, not to build a server farm, but to sit in the musty basement of the library with Clara, who had taken a lead advisory role. They worked together, designing a system that could digitize and cross-reference every birth certificate, every property deed, every yellowed newspaper article in the county's history. He was using his technology not to predict a future of consumer behavior, but to resurrect a past of human experience. He was building a bridge between his world and hers, a bridge made of code and memory. A year and a half after that fateful night at Aurelia, the project was complete. He asked Clara to come back to Havenwood with him for the official unveiling. The town was achingly familiar. The air smelled of damp earth and distant livestock, a scent that bypassed his memory and hit him straight in the soul. The old oak tree stood on the hill overlooking Miller's Pond, its branches like the arms of a patient, waiting grandfather. The library, however, was transformed. The crumbling facade had been restored, the interior a breathtaking fusion of old and new. The original dark wood shelving and worn floorboards remained, but seamlessly integrated were sleek, minimalist computer terminals and climate-controlled archival displays. He led her to the new archival room, the heart of the project. A large touch-screen display dominated one wall. "You saved them," she whispered, her hand hovering over a display case containing the town's fragile, handwritten charter from 1888. All these stories, they would have turned to dust. "We saved them," he corrected gently. "And we did more than that." He touched the large screen, and it came to life. It was a searchable, interactive map of Havenwood, spanning 2 centuries. He typed a name: Abigail Hayes. A web of connections appeared: birth records, marriage certificates, a grainy high school yearbook photo from 1958 of Clara's mother, young and smiling. He touched the photo, and a list of articles from the local paper appeared, mentioning her name as part of the school debate team. "Every person who ever lived here," Leo said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "has their story woven into the fabric of this place. I just used my tools to make the threads visible. You taught me how to see them." Tears were streaming down Clara's face, silent and unchecked. She reached out and touched the screen, her fingers tracing the image of her young mother. She was not just seeing a historical record. She was touching a life, a story made tangible through the fusion of their 2 worlds. He reached into his pocket, his hand closing around a small, smooth object he had carried with him for half his life. He pulled it out. It was a flat, grey stone, worn smooth by water and time, perfect for skipping. "I've kept this in my desk drawer in every office I've ever had," he said, his voice low and steady. "For 17 years. You gave it to me the day I left. You said it was so I wouldn't forget where I came from." He gently took her hand and placed the stone in her palm. It was cool and solid, a tangible piece of their shared earth. "I spent so long running from this place," he continued, his gaze holding hers, stripped bare of all artifice. "Running from the fear of failure, the fear of being small. But you never ran. You stayed and you fought. You tended the roots. You showed me that the only thing worth building is something that can stand the test of time. Something with history." He didn't kneel. He didn't offer a ring. Such a gesture felt hollow, a performance from a life he was leaving behind. Instead, he stood before her, his equal, his partner. "I don't want to just remember where I'm from anymore, Clara. I want to build my future here. I want to find the stories that haven't been written yet." He took a breath, the quiet hum of the archive's climate control the only sound in the room. "Clara Hayes, keeper of memories, archivist of my soul. Will you help me write ours?" Her sob was a sound of pure, unadulterated release. Her smile, when it broke through her tears, was as brilliant and life-affirming as the Iowa sun, breaking through storm clouds. She closed her hand tightly around the stone, the anchor of their past, the foundation of their future. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong and true. "Yes, it's the only story I've ever really wanted to write." He didn't kiss her then. Instead, he simply held her, his arms wrapped around her as she cried, a quiet, cleansing storm. They stood together in the heart of the sanctuary he had built for her, a place where past and future converged. Outside, the relentless, data-driven world churned on. But in here, surrounded by the enduring power of stories and the quiet promise of a shared life, they had finally found it. Not a summit to be conquered, but a center to hold. Their own true vantage point.